Okay, hello Naeem. So thanks for having me invited this afternoon, for allowing me to give a presentation on the Belgian EPD program. I will first of all give the participants a clear overview of what is ongoing in Belgium, a little bit history, and just that they have a good idea of what we are doing, and if they need further information they can contact me. And then in the second part I will pass on the words to Sophie Blanchard, who is working at one of the 3 regional authorities and who will explain the use of EPD in their great tool Totem. Next slide. Yeah, so maybe a quick word on who I am. I'm working at the Federal Public Service of Health, Food Chain Safety and Environment. And that's a little bit particular because we are, I think, one of the few program operators who are run by a federal authority or by an authority, which also means that in our general program instructions, we have a clear ambition that the environmental quality is one of the key aspects. One example of this is that in I think 5 years ago, it was we pushed really hard at CEN level and at the European level to have additional indicators in the EPDs because we thought it was not ambitious enough, and that then collided in the end to the set of additional indicators, which is now overtaken by the PEF set. We started already, I think it started when I joined the Ministry of Health and Environment in 2005. We immediately said we would focus on EPDs and try to have that as a guiding principle. And that, in fact, that's resulted in a royal decree, let's say legislation in 2014, which I will explain later on, which was one of the cornerstones for us to have to be able to act as a program operator. We are also, I think Naeem can testify, that quite active in European standardization and also at the European Commission, as to say that maybe we are sometimes a little bit slower in developing things, but we are quite active and at the heart of it all. And then the official start of the B-EPD program was in 2018. And we don't do it by ourselves. It's not because we are a ministry that we think we should be solo actors, but we have a steering group and a good network of active people and also active industry who are supporting us and who are also participating in a steering group. I think, by example, Piet Fitze, who is also attending today, is one who has been very active and supportive from the beginning, as many other companies in Belgium. And also, of course, Vito and Leuven, University of Leuven, and plenty of other people. Just to give, because I don't know really who is attending it, I've heard that it were mainly manufacturers who are interested in an EPD. And just to give an overview of what you should have in mind when you're talking about a B-EPD, this is the PDF document. But of course, the PDF document is only part of the story. And I think from the beginning, we have put the accent on digitalizing and digital access on XML formats. And this is also what we see which will happen in the future. So, added value of a B-EPD. I think that's a core question for most of the companies because we know an EPD, establishing an EPD, we shouldn't not mention it, but establishing an EPD today is not something very cheap. It's expensive, it takes time. So everybody should ask, what is the added value? The first added value which we see is, of course, the use of the EPD and the implementation of the EPD in Totem. Which is a Belgian tool developed by the regional authorities, in which, of course, we also participated to calculate the environmental impact of products based on life cycle assessment at building level. Sophie will talk about that later, much more in detail, with good knowledge of what it is. There's a clear link of Totem with BREEAM, because we know that for many manufacturers, but also for architects and builders, the BREEAM certification in Europe is very important. It's no secret that establishing an LCA, you don't just do it for marketing purposes, but it also gives you an insight in your manufacturing process, because it's one way to assess your product all the way from your resources to your design up to the use and end of use phase, where you can see where are impacts. But we know, and I think manufacturers can testify also, that where the environmental impact is high, very often it has to do with inefficient processes, not always, but a lot of times. And so when you have a good insight in your production process and the whole life cycle, you also have a good insight of where you can optimize your process, optimize your product. And we have a lot of examples of manufacturers who were able to do significant cost reductions. And then last but not least, it's a little bit the same, and that's very interesting to know that the legislation and the approach in Belgium and France is quite similar, is very similar. And that is that in the Royal Decree of 2014, we did some first important steps to stop greenwashing. Greenwashing as in promoting your products with some vague environmental claims. The rule is simple, the legislation is simple. You are free to use environmental claims on your product, but if a manufacturer decides to use one, he is obliged to establish a Belgian EPD and to register in the database. Of course, the legislation also was for us a reason to establish a database and to start collaborating with the regional authorities. So what is it for environmental claims and environmental messages? Green claims. The first step is that claim should be in line with ISO 14021, which is very important because it's an old standard established by industry, which by example says that you shall not use vague claims, you shall not use vague images, you shall not use terms like sustainable or other environmental friendly products. But it's a voluntary standard, and so now in Belgium it is included in the legislation and it has become mandatory. And as I just said in the previous slide, that's step one. And step two is you need to establish and register an EPD in the Belgian database, and you need to put a reference of that database on your product, only in case of environmental claims. But as you've heard before, also in France, there is similar legislation, which is good. Now, the next slide will be about the number of published BEPDs. You will see that there's a big difference with France, which is not surprising because we only started in 2018. And there has been a lot of changes on standards on the A1, A2, PEF 15824. It was all quite unclear. So we are now about 50 to 60 EPDs this year, and that is mainly because, which is a big, we see that the interest is very large. We get a lot of requests. It's definitely still growing, and that all has to do. We have the feeling that we really the liftoff is now. That's because in the past year, you see it here, we had some issues with Totem. And issues is maybe a bad word, but the thing is that from the beginning, we engaged ourselves that if a manufacturer establishes an EPD, it has to be usable in Totem. It has to be verified and usable in Totem. So that means that the part of non-verified EPDs, or the part of, in some countries we see it that of course, manufacturers are free to establish an EPD according to the rules. They have an EPD, then it is moved to the building level or to the building tool, and then it's okay, but we are missing information, it's too difficult, we need to do some adaptations. So that's something which we had to clarify between 2018 and 2019. And then Totem was launched also officially, and so we see a really big increase already up to almost 30 companies. So which I think is as of today is really good. The steps to draft a B-EPD is not so different than in other countries, but for clarity, I will go through them anyway. A nice arrow. So you contact us, you send us an email with functional units, what is a product, or your idea of a functional unit, what is the product you are thinking about, and then we can talk together on how to have the most efficient approach into grouping products, but also what markets are you active on in order to try to minimize duplication of work and to have it as cost efficient as possible. Then it's up to the manufacturer. It's his freedom to choose an LCA practitioner. Some companies have an in-house expert. Others, most of the other companies need to rely on some external experts, an LCA practitioner. You're free to choose your own. And we will also communicate what the rules are which you shall follow. And it's similar to the hierarchy in France. You have the 15804, which is at the core of everything. Then we have a Belgian complement, in fact, 2 Belgian complements. We have a normative document, the NBN DTD B08001, and we have an administrative annex to that, which clarifies a lot of issues. Why is that? That is because we do not work, also similar to France, I discovered today, we do not work with product-specific PCR documents in Belgium. But if there is a European PCR document, of course, that also prevails. Once you did a huge effort and interesting work of establishing your LCA, it needs to be verified. We have an established set of verifiers, which is still growing. But in the past year, I will show you, we now have 4 or 5 verifiers, and there's another one upcoming. And we are actively seeking for verifiers who are active and who are accepted in other programs, by example, in France or in Germany. You send a draft to us. We do an administrative check. We compare with what is in it. We have an editorial check. We give feedback together with a verifier who is the final responsible of the verification. And then it's the manufacturer or someone who helps him, who enters the data of the EPD in the database. There's an invoice to be paid. And we check, just like in France, we do an administrative check. Is everything okay from an administrative point of view? And is what has been entered in the database, is it the same as in the PDF documents? Which is quite a challenge because people who have done it know that there's a lot of numbers, but it needs to be done. Okay, next thing. This seems like quite a complex chart, but in fact it's not so complex. Let me explain it to you. We have heard in the previous presentations, and we know that there's a change in standards. The EN 15804 Annex 1 will be replaced by the Annex 2 in a couple of years, but there's a transition period. And a big question, and we heard it from someone some minutes ago, the big question is, of course, how will the EPD program deal with it, and how will they deal with it at building level? And we have clarified that because we think it's very important for manufacturers and also for architects and people who construct the building to have a clear outline and to have a clear horizon. So at this moment, we just finished last week a first testing period with A1 EPDs to have the coupling in a couple of, maybe next week. I think Sophie can help me next week or in 2 weeks.
Next week.
Next week to have the, thank you, to have the EPDs visible in Totem and also usable in Totem. So that test phase is done. It's now going live, and that's with A1 EPDs. With A1 EPDs with a national complement, which means additional indicators and additional life cycle stages. These EPDs will be visible. It's a limited set, but it's really the front runners and the active manufacturers who have supported us will be visible for 6 months. In these 6 months, and it's a warm call for participation to all manufacturers interested in a Belgian EPD. These 6 months, we will prepare the transition to EN 15804A2. And this means that again, there will be a test phase. We will modify totem. We will see if there's any modification needed, but probably not in our database or in our EPDs. Probably not, because we already anticipated it. And then after these 6 months, there will be a hard cut. I call it a hard cut. The A1 EPDs will still be visible in our database, EPD database, but they will not be used anymore in Totem, the building calculator. Totem will then only work with A2, just to have a very clear situation. So if anyone is interested in participating in a test phase, the advantage of it is that you have that you are more implied in the development, and that you have a preliminary insight, probably in your results and how Totem deals with your data. So another question which I have quite often on my desk from manufacturers is, okay, but we are active on both the Belgian and the French markets. Can we use the French EPD in Belgium, or can we use the Belgian EPD in France? I think that's a little bit the elephant in the room, which hasn't been mentioned until now. The answer is quite easily no, but almost. So I think what we have done is to, as you have seen, the rules are quite similar. I would say that for 90%, the establishing of your LCA and EPD is identical. So it's really important, or we give the advice that you seek, that you do it at the same time. We have seen manufacturers who do it in a consecutive way, first in one country and then in the other country, and that's not an efficient way of doing it. It gives much more complications and hence a higher cost. So it's really important to have your LCA practitioner do the efforts once, and maybe for multiple countries at the same time. And also try to find a verifier who is accepted in Belgium and France. For the time being, that is Naim from WeLOOP is one of the verifiers who is active in Belgium and France. And there's another person who is in the process of being in the acceptance procedure for being a verifier who is active in France, Belgium, and Germany. And if 90% is the same, that also means that there's some differences. And a lot of people say, oh, differences, how is this possible? Well, it's not so difficult to understand that if we look at building level, that some information is, unfortunately, but necessary, local, regional. If you talk about end of life, if you talk about transport, sometimes even if you talk about the range of the product, the installation of the product, there might be minor changes, but minor changes who have an impact when you calculate the impact at building level. So it is important to have a parallel approach, have different scenarios reflecting this reality. Luckily, between France and Belgium, the secondary data is not an issue. So for the time being, Totem, its background data was developed using EcoInvent and modifying that, adapting it to the Belgian geography. But we decided that for the time being, we accept EPDs, which are established using background data either from Gabi or from EcoInvent, which is, by example, not the case in the Netherlands, which only accepts EcoInvent, and which is also not so clear in Germany to know, okay, at building level for the EPDs, there's not an issue, but at building level, if it's important to check if eco-invent is accepted. Also similar to France, and that really was a parallel development, we foresee the possibility, it's not mandatory, but we foresee the possibility in EPD to have information on emissions into indoor air. And that is because we have a legislation also from 2014 for the time being for floor coverings, but hopefully with our new government in Belgium, also in the near future for other products, which lays down minimum requirements for certain uses of products put on the market. And we're also investigating further possibilities of mutual recognition. We have launched a small study to see what are the possibilities, and then to reach out to the French program operator and to the German program operator, or even the Dutch program operator, to see if higher levels of mutual recognition are possible. In the EPD, we have also included, and also preparatory to the totem implementation, some information, a possibility to include information on reversibility, which is for us the key aspect to achieve circularity. So there's two main tables. This is the table on if you have a product which is incorporated, how do you judge the reversibility? Is it non-reversible? How is it loose laying? How it is installed? And then there's 4 criteria: simplicity of disassembly, speed of disassembly, the ease of handling, and the robustness of the material. Just to give it a structured way in the EPD. And we already see that the manufacturers and the EPDs who are now working on their EN 15804A2 EPD already start thinking, reflecting about this, and trying to incorporate it in the EPD, which I think is very positive. As I said in the beginning, my goal is to give manufacturers a clear view on what to expect and how we work in Belgium. And I cannot not mention that it asks commitments from the manufacturers. Some of them will testify after me based on their experience, but for the new ones who listen, who see this presentation on YouTube, you have to be aware that it requests commitment. It's not just one single person who will do it all. It's a team effort because you need data from the operators. You need data from the people who do the incoming goods. You need electricity data. You need data maybe even from R&D departments. So you need to take that into account. It takes time and resources. You get a lot of reward for it and a lot of visibility and a lot of inside view, but it takes commitment. And what I didn't hear until now, but which I think is, it's not something which should be kept silent, but which we should talk about, is a cost. Of course, the cost of a B-EPD, it depends. It depends on the complexity of the product. If it's a very simple product with low transformation, with a limited set of production sites, then it can be quite easy, hence cheap. But sometimes it's much more complicated. But when it's complicated, a lot of production sites, a lot of similar products, we always push to have some grouping and to have some variability assessments to make it more affordable. The figures which we have is that to establish an EPD, it will be between 5,000 and 15,000 euros, depending on the complexity. This year, we launched a program, a support program for small and medium enterprises. Unfortunately, there was some big, well, very small, in fact, a small annoyance. It's called a virus, which caused a lot of manufacturers to put some things on hold. What we now see is that the first wave is gone and it starts to speed up again. And the idea is to assess if it's possible to repeat that for small and medium enterprises the coming years, just to make it more affordable. And to not just have an EPD for the big companies, but also for the smaller enterprises. From an administrative point of view, it's very cheap in Belgium. We only ask about 200 euros per EPD, and it's a digressive cost. And there are also some, but I think that's only for the companies from Belgium. There are some other aid measures, like a KMO portefeuille. That's a support in the Flemish region for small and medium enterprises. And there's also special loans in the Walloon region. But for this, I think you better contact me later, or some experts in those regions. For the time being, the LCA, most EPDs and LCAs were done by LCA experts from WeLOOP, like Naïm, but also Vito, RDC Environnement, University of Liège, and the BBRI or the CSTC in Belgium. But it's of course not limited to those, but they have the experience already. So this is the preliminary sets, or the current set of verifying persons. Of course, if V2 does the life cycle assessments, they cannot verify it, and it has to be someone else. And you also see that our host of today is on the list. This is the website, very big, so you will not forget it, on where you can find additional information, and also jump through that website to access the database. And now I have included some screenshots of the online application, where you can make an account, where you can log in, where the manufacturer can enter his data. There's some minor changes ongoing. So there's a lot of data to be entered. I will not go into detail. Here you can see this. For in Totem, because we're in Belgium, we are trilingual. Yeah, we are that good. So it needs to be in Totem, it needs to be in Dutch, French, and English. German is not mandatory, but so we have foreseen this option. If you're not interested in Totem, you're not. It's not mandatory to enter the translation. I will jump to this, and I come to the conclusion before handing over the word to Sophie Blanchard. So in short, and as a summary, B-EPD is mandatory in case of environmental claim, and if you want to have visibility and integration in Totem. And Sophie will talk about how Totem is used, how it will be used by authorities, and a policy line. It's rapidly growing. We have started very early following it, but the real implementation only started for me last year. There is a low administrative cost. And from my point of view, I think it's quite compatible with French EPDs. There's really some efficiency gains to be found there. So if you do both at the same time, I think the outcome is much more of higher value than doing them in a consecutive way. And last but not least, so we are starting a new test phase. So if you know manufacturers, or if you are a manufacturer, please contact us to establish an EPD A2. And if you have interested verifying parties, also let us know. The slides, I hope that Naïm will share the slides. And at the last page, you have some email addresses for questions on EPD, the Totem help desk, and also on our newsletter. So that was it from my side. And now I will give the word to Sophie.
Yes, Dieter, thank you. I'm not sure if there is questions. Anybody wants to ask a question to Dieter?
Should we do questions now or after Sophie?
Yes, you can make a question and then we start the presentation.
Two quick questions from me, Lorelia from One Click LCA.
Yeah, okay.
in Belgium, do you have extra indicators that are different to the French? Like in France, you have water pollution, air pollution. Is there anything similar in the Belgium addendum?
Good question. It depends on whether we look at A1, 15824 or the 15824 A2. For those companies who are right now in Totem, who have their EPD based on the 15824 A1, there are additional indicators, which are the PEF indicators from the official journal as published in the official journal. For the A2, so I think that's the main part, and I hope, in fact, it's a recommendation that every manufacturer who drafts an EPD as from today, it will be according to the 15824 A2. Regarding the indicators, we 100% use the ones in the 15804, but the core sets and the additional set of indicators, but no additional ones.
Okay, great. And then the second question I had is, I'm not familiar with Totem, but is it a building life cycle assessment tool, or is it just a tool where people can look for EPDs?
No. It's very clear. It's a building assessment tool, and you will now have a small presentation on how it looks like and what it does. But it's really to enter your model, your building, and based on either EPDs, if they are available, or on generic data, it calculates your environmental impact, and you are able to compare and optimize your building.
Okay. And this only uses Belgium EPDs, if I'm correct.
Exactly.
Okay, great. Many thanks.
Okay, you're welcome.